Hello friends, family, fellow patriots, Lord Stompy here, welcome. This video is part 3 of the series on the geostrategy behind the Pajit invasion of the West. Now in my previous videos, and there's a link to my first video below, I recommend you watch it if you want to get a background on what is going on here. So the massive Indian demographic invasion that's now coming into every Western land at this point in time. This is part of our Western leaders' philosophy of trying to secure control of Eurasia, the Eurasian region. The Western powers desperately need a strong ally in Eurasia. The Russians and Chinese are building the Belt and Road through there. They're beginning to exercise a massive amount of geostrategic control over that region. And our Western leaders need to keep some skin in the game. So part of the deal of our Western leaders sucking up to the Indian leaders is they've allowed the colonization of our Western lands by the hordes of India. Right? They've secretly done a deal with the Indian rulers to keep things smooth with the Indian leaders, and essentially our Western leaders are desperately trying to keep some skin in the game in Eurasia, and this is part of their strategy. When you look around the streets and just see them swarming, like in the last 10 years, suddenly the streets of every Western land are just swarming with Indians. You've got to realize this is part of our elites' strategy for retaining geopolitical power in the world, right? They're essentially, the Western empires have been in decline for a long time, right? And this is to some degree, the Indian invasion is a desperate attempt for our leaders to retain control. They need to keep some skin in the game somehow. So if you watch my first video, I totally explain this. Now, in this video, I want to talk about how Freemasonry in India and the British East India Company in India, to a large degree, laid down the foundations of the geopolitical crises that we are experiencing now. And on top of that, British Freemasonry and religious groups such as Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, all these various groups, they sprang up out of colonial India, and they were actually a cooperation between the Western colonial leaders and the Indian elites. And essentially, I've talked about this in my previous videos, but the Indians until this day love to kvetch and moan and complain about Western imperialism, Western colonialism. Oh, it was so bad. These European people were so exploitative, they were so evil. And what I pointed out in one of my previous videos was very early on in the game, the Indian leaders actually realized that they needed European colonialism in India to secure their rule. So if you look at India before the British got there, it was a shithole. It was completely undeveloped. It was a bunch of small states run by mostly by warlords, and these states were always fighting with each other. So to be a leader in India was very precarious before the English got there. States were always overthrowing each other. The leaders of different states were always being assassinated, executed. So until the British got to India, it was a very uncivilized, barbaric part of the world. So essentially, the Indian leadership they very quickly came to rely on the British colonial elites to secure their leadership for them. And this meant that the colonial British and the colonial Indians had a very large degree of cooperation at the higher levels. And to a large degree, all the complaining and moaning and these calls for Indian nationalism from the great Indian nationalist leaders, essentially they were to some degree kabuki theatre. And I pointed out in my previous video that a lot of the most highly regarded Indian nationalist leaders, such as Mahatma Gandhi, they were very happy to go to England and be educated in English elite schools. They were very happy to go to England and rub shoulders with the high-level British intellectual classes, the British nobility, the high-level British merchants. So a lot of these people were going to England and getting along just absolutely famously with the British ruling classes. And then they were coming back and making all this noise about how bad the British were, when in fact they were actually really good friends with them. And this served a purpose, a very important purpose, of essentially the Indian ruling classes were being propped up by the British colonial power. But the Indians had to make it seem, the Indian ruling classes had to make it seem like they opposed the British rule. So on a superficial level, they had to walk around complaining and kvetching. And so this was a kind of safety valve function. It made the lower level, it made the lower caste Indians feel like the Indian ruling classes were on their side. The Indian ruling class, we're on your side. We're against these British colonialists. Okay, so that was an important part of the function. Now, where things get interesting is there was centuries of cooperation between the Indian ruling classes and the British ruling classes. And very early on, this cooperation began to manifest in the Freemasonic lodges. Now, Freemasonry, in its earliest phases, in England, in Britain, you could only be a European of virtue and a Christian to join Freemasonry. But hundreds of years ago, the requirement to be European and Christian was dropped. And the reason for this is that Masonic lodges, especially in the colonies, were essentially, there were information gathering and networking agencies. Okay, so there was somewhat outside of the standard military and government agencies, but what was happening was your military, your intellectuals, your bureaucrats, all these people from from your ruling classes could gather in Freemason lodges and share information. So in India, very early on in the rise of Freemasonry in India, they began allowing some of the loyal Indian rulers to attend the lodges. Okay, so there was a reason for this, right? For the British rule to continue smoothly, they had to let the Indian elites, know that they had some skin in the game of ruling their own country. So, in the end, they decided it was in the best interests of the British ruling classes to allow the trustworthy Indian leaders to actually join these lodges. And the British leadership began allowing the Indians to push their own spirituality, their own Indian philosophy, their own ideas. And this is why they dropped the requirement for Freemasons to be Christian and European, right? Essentially, Freemasonry it went from being a European Christian group to being a universalist cult very quickly. So this served as for a purpose of information gathering, information sharing, networking, all throughout the colonies. And when you are allowing the native people to join in, the native people that you trusted, it made these native people feel like that they were part of the great game, right? They were like, oh wow, these British are being really kind to us. They're letting us have a seat at the table. They're letting us share in this game of power, right? This is the seductive allure of power, right? You allow the people that you're ruling over to have a little taste of that power, and a large proportion of them will suddenly support you. Okay, so now this isn't just conjecture on my part. I'm going to go to this page here. This is the Grand Lodge of India, Grand Lodge of Ancient Free and Accepted Masons of India. This is their official webpage. Now, here on their page, their description of what I'm telling you, it basically totally backs up what I've been saying. So here, Grand Lodge of India says, although the contemporary history of Freemasonry in India can be traced back to the year 1961, when the Grand Lodge of India was formed, Freemasonry was being widely followed throughout Europe and the English colonies, following the establishment of the Grand Lodges of England, Scotland and Ireland. The nobility, clergy and military personnel and men of influence sought to become part of the fraternity. British India was no exception. In fact, within just 12 years of the constitution of the Grand Lodge of England, constituted for the purpose of exercising supervision over the lodges in London and its neighbouring areas, a petition was sent by a few brethren in India to constitute a provincial Grand Lodge in due form at Fort William, Calcutta. The petition was granted, a provincial Grand Master was appointed to supervise Masonic activity in India and the Far East in the year of 1729. In India, British influence gradually spread through the East India Company. Okay, this is all reinforcing what I've just told you. The lodges were established by the military, the railways and the bureaucracy. So, as I said, this is information gathering, information sharing, networking. although the military played the most prominent role. At the close of the French and Indian Peninsula Wars, there were, in addition to military static and travelling lodges, more than 100 lodges warranted by the 3 Grand Lodges. Military lodges greatly accelerated the growth of colonial Freemasonry. Networking, see? This is how you use intelligence and clever strategy to expand your sphere of influence rapidly. It is no wonder that many prominent military leaders of the French Revolutionary and Indian Wars were Freemasons, such as Lord Nelson, Sir Charles Napier, Lieutenant General Sir Eyre Coote, Lord Lake, Hastings, Dalhousie, the Duke of Wellington, Sir William Lockhart, Lord Kitchener. Historical records indicate that the son of Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan, was also himself a member of the fraternity. So now the Indian Masonic Lodge is openly admitting that many Indian leaders were members of the lodge. So what you're seeing here is all these great English commanders and leaders are rubbing shoulders with the Indian leaders. Now, if the Indians truly hated colonial rule and they truly despised it, why were they joining the most elite societies that the British themselves had set up, and why were they rubbing shoulders with the British ruling classes in peace and harmony in the Masonic lodges? Right? This is completely Jewish thinking here. When these Indians tell us, oh, you Westerners are very bad, colonialism and all that. It's you guys were really happy to be a part of it. You guys not only were very happy, you were net beneficiaries. And whereas the British colonialists had to do all the heavy lifting and all the deep strategy, the Indian leaders, they were just happy to go along for the ride. So, okay. So now the Grand Lodge of India on their website is listing some prominent Indian members. First one they mention is Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda is a very, very important person in not just Indian Freemasonry, but he is the Indian guru in the late 19th century who popularized Hinduism in the West. So he was a Freemason and he was received into the West with wild acclaim. When he got to the West, Vivekananda was lauded and praised by all the Western media of the late 19th century. They said he was a man of vision, a holy man of wisdom. One newspaper in the USA even said that his wisdom was superior to that of any Christian leader we had. This is the kind of groveling, even in the late 19th century, the media was doing towards these Indian leaders. So, wait a minute. Let's see. Here's some more Indian leaders who are Freemasons. Motilal Nehru, Ramaswamy Iyer, Dr. P.V. Shirley, Maharaja of Patiala and Fakhruddin Al-Ahmed, Ashok Kumar, Madlav Rao. Look, there's a huge... I can't read these Indian names. They're kind of pretty crazy names. There's a huge list of incredibly prominent Indians that have all been part of Freemasonry in India for well over 100 years. So what we have seen in the last 120, 130 years here in Western nations is a massively growing influence of Indian philosophy, Indian spirituality, Indian demographics, and this has been going on for a long, long time. Okay, this has been part and parcel of a very long-term plan for the Battle of Eurasia, and the Kalergi replacement of Western people within their own nations by Indians, and the Indian philosophy and the Indian spirituality. When you get a demographic replacement in your nation, basically the philosophies and the religions of that class shall then dominate your society from that point on. So this domination of the mind, this domination of the mind and spirit by Indian Hinduism, this was beginning to happen more than 120 years ago here in the West. Now, one of the first instances of this popular domination of Indian and Asiatic ideas was Madame Blavatsky, the Theosophical Society, Annie Besant. Now, Blavatsky's right-hand man, and he's the guy who founded the Theosophical Society, was a man called Henry Steele Olcott. And he was an ex-military officer, and he was also a Freemason. So he founded the first Theosophical Societies in the West. And this had a major function. So the Theosophical Societies were being founded in the later part of the 19th century. And this is where, in my opinion, Western people were working in India and other foreign nations. And what they were doing, essentially, they were very successfully becoming foreign agents. So when guys like Henry Steele Olcott and Blavatsky and Annie Besant were spending huge amounts of time in India. They were rubbing shoulders with all the Indian nobility, the Indian holy classes, and they were telling all these Indians, we've accepted your way of life, we've accepted your way of thinking, we're going around wearing all these robes, and we're promoting your philosophy and your religion in the West. Now, what this did was it made this class of Pajitified Westerners, in the eyes of the Indians, it made these people seem like they were very, very sympathetic, and they were very, very eager to embrace the Indian spirituality and culture. So superficially, this was the case. These people were beginning to act, they were doing their best to act like Indian gurus, and they were promoting Indian ideas and philosophy all over the West. But this had a twofold function, right? On one hand, the Indian subcontinent, it was a huge place, and it had an immense amount of riches and resources that the European elites were keen to always have their hands upon, right? And also India was really, northern India is part of Eurasia, so the Western elites had a huge amount of strategic interest in the Indian nation. So towards the later part of British colonial rule was they were training their own people to be very, very sympathetic to the Indians, so that essentially there'd be all this crossover between the higher caste Indians and the Western elites. And the Western elites, then they could essentially become agents of the Western elites would be gathering intelligence, they'd be networking with all the Indians, they would be influencing the Indian leadership with their ideas. But on another hand, these Western networks in India were also a very important safety valve. That it essentially was a safety valve to diffuse Indian nationalism from ever getting too much traction. Now, if you think about it, if your nation is occupied by a foreign power and you've been occupied for centuries by that foreign power, and your people are getting sick of this, right? And what the occupying power does is it begins adopting the customs, the mannerisms, the spirituality of your nation, and saying, hey guys, we're now one of you, right? This is very clever strategically. This ends up being a safety valve, because a large number of Indian people began to think, well, these European people, they're not so bad, because they're very sympathetic to us. They're beginning to adopt our customs. They're beginning to promote our customs within their own nations. So there was this strange Kalergi globo homo thing going on at the highest levels of power between the Western elites and the British elites. And this, once again, this is why the British dropped the requirements to be a European Christian when it came to joining Freemasonry. Okay? The British were very, very clever, right? They essentially, the longer that British colonial rule lasted in India, the more the British relied on allowing the Indians to have a lot of skin in the game. They were allowing the Indian rulers to peddle more and more influence. And the deal was, as long as these Indian leaders allowed the British to stay there, and as long as they didn't cause too much trouble. That's the key to this, right? So what the colonial leadership was doing when it first got to India, essentially they relied on muscle and strategy, right? The initial waves of British colonialists, there were staunch Christians. They were they were men of might. They were men of valor. You know, no matter what negative things they did in their rule, you cannot fault the original British colonizers for being very, very staunch. They were men of iron, and they stuck to their principles. They were staunchly Christian, and then over time, over centuries, as the British Empire in India became more and more decadent, more and more rotten, what the British leadership was doing was it was acquiescing and giving in, and basically allowing the Indians to have more and more influence within the British colonial systems. And this was a way of placating the Indian leaders into allowing the British to continue to stay there. So essentially, now that I've explained this, this process in India, this gradual, slow process where the colonial ruling classes were allowing themselves willingly, as part of a strategy, to become more and more Pajitified. What you're seeing here is this is the classic slow death of an empire. If you look into the work of researchers such as Sir John Glubb or Oswald Spengler and many other classic researchers who looked into what makes empires fall, in the end, empires fall because the ruling classes, they always start out as men of iron, and they always end up as men of paper right at the end. And as they become as the ruling classes at the end of an empire, they just become more and more an army of pen pushers and influencers, but is the best way to look at them. So instead of using might and muscle and military strategy to dominate an area, the final stage of empires is just these really decadent playboys is the best way to put it. The leaders end up just these decadent playboys who end up placating and appeasing is their final strategy, right? They no longer rely on the strength of arms, but they rely on all this essentially just all this bureaucratic strategy of appeasement and groveling and come on, let us stay in your country, we got a good thing going, guys, come on. And one example of this end of the colonial era, actually, there's these old videos on YouTube by this old colonial buffoon. His name is Captain Hogspear. Type in Captain Hogspear. Right, so this guy, they made these videos about 20 years ago, and he was one of the last British ruler guys in the British Raj, and the dude is a complete toad. He's one of those old school English buffoons. Most of his video, this guy's about 80 years old in these videos, and he's always just sitting there with a huge cigar and a glass of brandy, and he's just the most decadent bitch. And the way he speaks, so he brags about his decadence and his bad behavior while he was in India. So one example was he's there with his brandy and his cigar, and Hogspear is saying, oh yes, there was one time back in India, and I used to be very good friends with the Sultan of Bengal. We're always going hunting together. Lovely chap, except one day he came home and found me rogering his wife. And that was the end of that. What I'm saying here is this guy's example of just the completely buffoonish playboy type of person, that they're the final phase of your empire, right? They're totally mingling with the natives. They're bragging about having affairs with native women. Their time of being in this a ruler in this empirical land is just, they just brag of their decadence and their stupidity. These men at the end of empires, they're cowards, they're weaklings, they're stupid. And the final phase is the only way they can hold their empire together is through a network of decadence and bureaucratic influence. Right? They no longer have the moral might and the courage and the balls to actually lay down the law in the land that they've conquered. So the degeneracy and the influence of this mixing of the Indian elites and the Western elites, it all began in the late 19th century. In 1893, here it was in Chicago, was a number of these very progressive European groups, such as the Theosophical Society. They decided to have the world's first parliament of religions, and this essentially was the world's first great interfaith meeting between all the religions of the world. Now, of course, this was promoted as being a wonderful step towards world peace, and even towards one world religion, where every religion essentially just cooperates with every other religion. And the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago in 1993, even by that stage, there was 4 representatives from India, and the Indian representatives far outnumbered any other representative from any other country. So every other country only had 1 or 2 representatives. So even going back well over 100 years, essentially here in the West, we had a core group of elites, of intellectual and spiritual leaders in groups such as the Theosophical Society, who were incredibly keen to push Indian philosophy and Indian spirituality. So the main star of the World Parliament of Religions was the Indian Freemason, Swami Vivekananda. So this guy ended up having the most positive press all over the Western world. When he came to the World Parliament of Religions and spoke in the Western press all over the world, afterwards he was promoted as this jewel of Indian wisdom and Indian spirituality. And then he immediately after this wave of Western publicity, of very, very positive and popular Western publicity, he went on hundreds of speaking dates throughout Europe, throughout America, throughout Britain, promoting Indian religion and philosophy. Almost immediately, he opened up his first kind of ashram in New York. Only 1 year later, 1894, he opened up an ashram in New York on 33rd Street. Now, Vivekananda was a Mason, so this is why he opened up his ashram on 33rd Street. Very soon after that, he was donated huge tracts of prime land in California. Like, I think it was like one of these parcels of land was 68 acres. So here's this Indian holy guy, just turns up out of nowhere in Europe. The Western press give him this heroic welcome, and they give him millions of dollars of publicity all across the West. Free publicity, right? What a wonderful man. Oh, he's the man of the future. He's going to help us combine all the world's religions because he's this very wise, smart Indian guru. And then he immediately opens up ashrams in the West and has huge amounts of prime land donated to him. So one can clearly see the hand of the Freemasonic societies and the Theosophical Society. For Swami Vivekananda to have this amount of influence and leverage in the West in the late 19th century this is just incredible. So this clearly shows that more than 100 years ago there was a long-term agenda to basically slowly dismantle Christianity and promote these Eastern religions, especially Hinduism. And once again, this is all part of this influence peddling and strategizing from the Freemasons, from the British elites, from the East India Trading Company, from the Theosophical Society. It's just an absolute clusterfuck of what I would call the late stage of an empire, when basically running a world empire just goes to everybody's heads and just everything becomes just this clusterfuck knot of all these different parties are trying to influence each other, and they're all trying to have these grand long-term strategies, and everyone's using each other. It's really quite bloody stupid when you break it down. It's everything at the end of empires ends up becoming this huge, stupid strategic game of smoke and mirrors. Right, and it's always, right, it's nearly always at the end of empires is the ruling classes of all the different parties involved. So you had the ruling classes of India, the ruling classes of the West, were all involved in this massive game, this global game of smoke and mirrors. And essentially, this long-term geostrategic game, it's still going now. So you saw that Swami Vivekananda and the Theosophical Society, backed by the Freemasons, that was the first wave of Indian thought and spirituality into the West. Now, if you win the psychological and the spiritual battle right at the start, that is 75% of your work done. Okay, so the Pagetification of the West, it started in the late 19th century, where the soul of Western man was being seduced by all these Hindu ideas, by the idea that the Indian people are somehow these exotic, highly spiritual, high IQ people that Western people should be deeply interested in. And this campaign of influence of the Western mind, it continued up until the 60s. We suddenly saw an explosion of our rock stars such as the Beatles, Donovan, even Hendrix to a degree. They were hanging around the Maharishi. We suddenly had Osho, Sai Baba, recently Sadhguru, Indian intellectuals such as Arundhati Roy. And this has been part of a long-term plan to basically pagetify the Western nations. A big part of that is the Kalergi plan, and a big part of that is essentially the Western colonialists. They agreed to allow the Indians to colonize us in exchange for for the Indian rulers, sharing power in the Eurasian zone. There's a lot more I could say on this, but I'm going to end it here. Thank you.